My name is Graham. I've lived in the Cascades of Oregon for 40 years, working as a timber cruiser. My job is to go into sections of the forest before the logging crews arrive, measuring the density and health of the old-growth Douglas firs. It's solitary work, often taking me miles away from the nearest forest road, into places where the ground is so thick with pine needles that your footsteps don't make a sound. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've shared trails with cougars, and I've had black bears sniff around my tent at 2 a.m. In the woods, you learn that every animal has a rhythm. Every predator has a tell. But there is something in these mountains that doesn't follow the rules of the wild. Something the old-timers call the mountain giant, but what the internet calls Bigfoot. It happened in October of last year, near a jagged ridge known as Broken Claw. The air was unusually still that morning, cold, damp, and smelling of wet cedar and rotted wood. I was marking a stand of timber when the wrongness hit me. It didn't start with a sound or a sight. It started with a feeling in my chest. It was a low, vibrating pressure, like the bass from a distant concert, but it was coming from inside the earth. It made my stomach flip, and a sudden, irrational wave of nausea washed over me. This is what researchers call infrasound, a frequency below the range of human hearing that triggers a primal fight-or-flight response. The forest went dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, even the wind seemed to stop. Then I smelled it. It wasn't the smell of a skunk or a wet dog. It was a thick, cloying stench of stagnant swamp water, fermented musk, and something metallic like old blood. It was so potent, it made my eyes water. I gripped my marking hatchet and turned slowly. About 40 yards away, behind a massive fallen cedar, a shadow moved. But it wasn't a shadow. It was a vertical mass of dark, matted hair, so large it blocked out the light behind it. It stood up. It didn't stand like a bear. It rose with a fluid, human-like motion, unfolding its massive frame until it was easily 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were so broad, they looked like the bumper of a semi-truck. The hair was a deep charcoal gray, thick with mud and pine resin. It didn't roar, it didn't growl, it just stood there, swaying slightly from side to side, a behavior hunters call weaving. I looked at its face, and that's when my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a monkey. It was a face that looked terrifyingly human, but carved out of stone. Deep-set eyes under a heavy, bony brow and a wide, flat nose. Those eyes, they weren't glowing, but they had a depth of intelligence that no animal should possess. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking through me. Then, the vibration in my chest intensified. The creature opened its mouth slightly, and a sound came out that I felt more than I heard. It was a woof, a short, explosive burst of air that hit me like a physical blow. Thump. I felt my knees buckle. My vision blurred at the edges. I realized then that I wasn't being hunted. I was being disoriented. It was using sound as a weapon, paralyzing me before it even made a move. I was paralyzed. My boots felt like they were anchored in lead, and the nausea was so thick I could taste copper in the back of my throat. The creature, the mountain giant, continued its rhythmic weaving, its massive arms hanging down past its knees. Every time it swayed, I could hear the faint, wet sound of its matted hair rubbing against its torso. Then, from the ridge directly above me, came a sound that broke the trance. Whack. It was the sound of wood hitting wood. A single, powerful blow, so loud it echoed through the hollow like a rifle shot. A second later, another whack answered from across the ravine to my left. They were communicating. I wasn't dealing with a lone predator. I was in the middle of a coordinated perimeter. The giant in front of me didn't move, but it shifted its gaze toward the ridge. In that split second of diverted attention, the pressure in my chest eased just enough for me to gasp for air. I didn't wait. I didn't think about the timber I was supposed to cruise. I turned and sprinted back toward the direction of my truck, 4 miles away. I hadn't gone 50 yards when the first stone hit. It wasn't a pebble. It was a grapefruit-sized river rock, and it slammed into the trunk of a fir tree just inches from my head with enough force to spray splinters of bark into my face. They weren't trying to kill me, not yet. They were hurting me. I scrambled over a moss-covered log, my breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. The forest, which usually felt like my office, now felt like a giant green cage. Every time I tried to veer toward the easier path along the creek, another whack would erupt from the brush, forcing me back toward the steep, rocky slope of the ridge. I could hear it behind me now, not the sound of a heavy beast crashing through the woods, but a terrifyingly light footfall. For something that weighed nearly 1,000 pounds, it moved with the grace of a ghost. I'd hear a twig snap to my left, then a rustle of ferns to my right. It was playing with me, matching my pace, flanking me through the dense undergrowth. "Hey, over here!" The voice was clear, sounding like a man's shout from just over the next rise. My heart leaped. Maybe there was another logging crew? Maybe someone had heard me? "Help! I'm over here!" I screamed, turning toward the voice. But as I moved toward the sound, I stopped cold. The voice didn't repeat the shout. Instead, it began to whistle. A long, mournful tune that my father used to whistle when he was working in the shed. A tune that no stranger in these woods could possibly know. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a man. It was it. It was mimicking the sounds of my own memories, pulling them out of the air, or maybe out of my own head during that infrasound trance. The mountain giant appeared again, stepping onto the trail 20 feet ahead of me. It didn't look curious anymore. Its upper lip was pulled back, revealing massive, square teeth, and its brow was furrowed in an expression of pure, territorial fury. It reached out and gripped a sapling, a young hemlock about 4 inches thick, and with a casual flick of its wrist, it snapped the tree in half like a dry toothpick. It was a display of power, a warning that the routine of my life was over, and I was now standing in a world where I was nothing but a trespasser. The snapping of that hemlock tree sounded like a bone breaking in the silence of the woods. I didn't stay to watch the creature's next move. I dove off the trail, sliding down a steep embankment of loose volcanic scoria and wet pine needles. I knew this area. About half a mile east, near the base of the ridge, there was an entrance to an old lava tube, a subterranean tunnel formed thousands of years ago by cooling magma. It was a gamble. In a tunnel, I'd be cornered. But in a tunnel, their size would be a disadvantage, and the infrasound might lose its focus in the twisting basalt walls. As I scrambled toward the cave mouth, the wood knocks became frantic. Whack, whack, whack. It sounded like a drumline of giants closing in from all sides. I could hear the heavy, thudding impact of stones hitting the ground behind me, stones the size of bowling balls now. One clipped my shoulder, spinning me around, but the adrenaline was so thick I barely felt the pain. I reached the entrance, a jagged black hole in the earth, hidden behind a curtain of dripping ferns. I didn't hesitate. I clicked on my headlamp and plunged into the dark. The air inside the lava tube was instantly different. It was cold, still, and carried the ancient scent of dust and damp stone. I ran, my light bouncing off the rippled basalt walls that looked like frozen waves of black water. I went deep, weaving through the narrow sections where the ceiling dropped to barely 5 feet. I stopped after about 200 yards, dousing my light. I stood in absolute crushing darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack. Then, I heard it. At the mouth of the cave, something massive was moving. The sound of the ferns being pushed aside was followed by a heavy, slow scraping, the sound of fur and muscle dragging against the narrow rock entrance. It was coming in. I began to move deeper into the tube, feeling my way along the walls. The basalt was sharp, cutting my fingertips, but I didn't care. I needed to find a pinch point, a place where the tunnel was too small for a 9-foot giant. Suddenly, the infrasound returned, but inside the cave, it was different. The low-frequency vibration hit the curved walls and began to resonate. The air in the tunnel started to hum, a deep, vibrating drone that felt like it was trying to liquefy my internal organs. I fell to my knees, my head swimming, the darkness spinning around me. Graham, 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 Graham. The voice didn't come from the entrance. It echoed from the walls themselves. It was my mother's voice. It was my boss's voice. It was the voice of the ranger I'd spoken to that morning. All of them merged into a single, terrifying harmonic. Why are you hiding in the dark? Graham? A massive hand, gray, leathery, and covered in matted hair, slapped against the wall just a few feet behind me. I could hear the creature's breathing now. It was a wet, heavy wheeze, smelling of rot and ancient musk. It was crawling on all fours, its massive bulk filling the entire diameter of the tunnel. I reached into my pocket and found my emergency chalk, the bright red chalk I used for marking danger trees. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have a flare, but I knew the geology of this tube. I felt the wall until my hand found a narrow vertical fissure, a gas vent that led to the surface. It was barely wide enough for a man, but it was my only exit. I began to climb, wedging my body into the crack, the rock tearing at my clothes and skin. Below me, the giant reached the base of the fissure. It let out a sound I will never forget, not a roar, but a long, mournful whistle that sounded like a steam engine dying in the distance. The tunnel erupted in sound. The creature began to slam its fists against the basalt walls, the impact shaking the very foundation of the mountain. Rocks began to fall from the ceiling. The infrasound reached a crescendo, a frequency so high it made my nose begin to bleed. I pushed upward, my fingers raw, my breath coming in jagged sobs until I saw a glimmer of gray light above me. I burst through the opening of the gas vent like a man escaping a tomb. I scrambled onto the forest floor, my lungs burning as they took in the cold, rain-scented air. I didn't look back at the black slit in the earth. I knew the mountain giant couldn't follow me through that narrow crack, but I also knew that for a creature like that, the mountain was not a barrier, it was a home. I ran the final mile to my truck in a state of total sensory overload. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bone breaking. Every shadow of a swaying fir tree looked like a hunched, hairy shoulder. When I finally saw the white paint of my Ford F-150 through the trees, I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, oily dread. The truck was sitting exactly where I'd left it, but something was wrong. As I got closer, I saw that the heavy steel canopy over the truck bed had been peeled back like a sardine can. Not dented, not pried, peeled. The thick metal was curled into spirals, and my heavy gear, the chainsaws, the fuel cans, the steel cables had been taken out and arranged on the ground in a perfect geometric circle around the vehicle. In the center of the circle, sitting on the hood of the truck, was my marking hatchet. It had been driven 3 inches deep into the engine block. I didn't stop to investigate. I jumped into the cab, thankful that the keys were in my pocket. The engine groaned, struggling against the damage, but it turned over. I floored it, the tires screaming on the gravel as I tore down the logging road, leaving Broken Claw Ridge behind me. I drove for 3 hours without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the bright artificial lights of a truck stop in Medford. I sat in the cab for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, just watching the people, truckers, families, travelers, moving about their normal, routine lives. They had no idea that just 50 miles away, the rules of biology and physics were being rewritten in the dark. I quit my job the next morning. The doctor told me I was suffering from a concussive acoustic event. He said the bleeding in my nose and the persistent ringing in my ears were consistent with being too close to a high-pressure blast. He gave me pills for the nausea and told me to stay away from loud noises. But he couldn't explain the static. Ever since that day, I can't stand the silence. When a room gets too quiet, I start to feel that vibration in my chest again. I hear the 3-note whistle in the hum of my refrigerator. I see the weaving motion in the flickering of a fluorescent light. And then there are the gifts. Every once in a while, I'll wake up and find something on my porch. Sometimes it's a smooth river stone. Sometimes it's a bundle of cedar twigs tied together with a strand of coarse charcoal gray hair. And once, just last month, I found a small red plastic fire truck exactly like the one from the stories of Whispering Pines. I don't live in the Cascades anymore. I moved to a high-rise in the city, surrounded by the constant, reassuring roar of traffic. But some nights, when the fog rolls in from the coast and the city noise dies down to a low, rhythmic thrum, I'll look out my window at the distant, dark silhouette of the mountains. I'll see a single, massive shadow standing on a rooftop across the street, swaying slowly from side to side. And then, my phone will buzz with a text message from an unknown number. It's never words. It's just an audio file. And when I play it, all I hear is the sound of my own voice, recorded from a distance, whispering, "Routine check, Graham. Everything is right where you left it." The mountain giants don't just hunt you in the woods, they follow the echo you leave behind. They map the frequencies of your life until they know your routine better than you do. And once they have your sound, they never, ever let you go back to the silence.